Arabian Winds by Linda Chaikin. Chapter 4. Allison had risen early and dressed comfortably in blue cambray, right? Chambray, cambray cotton. She had drawn her lush hair back from her face for coolness, and was now seated at one of the long dining tables with General Blaine and his wife. Tension gnawed at her insides, but she tried to mask it. Baroness Helga Kruger, who kept lavish homes for entertaining foreign dignitaries and their wives in both Cairo and Aleppo, rose and made an announcement. Her German accent was not heavy, but charmed her hearers. She referred briefly to the tragic death of Major Karl Reuter and then reminded everyone of her assistant's previous warning that the location of the expedition huts could be dangerous due to the number of desert vipers and scorpions. Everyone was to be especially cautious, and no one under any circumstances was to hike to any ruins in or near the huts without a Turkish guide. Anyone doing so would temporarily be suspended from membership and called in for questioning by the Turkish authorities. "Well, Sarah," said General Blaine in a low voice, "that's the end of your jaunt out to the digs." "Nonsense," she replied. She didn't...
Wait a minute, who said that? Okay.
"Nonsense," she replied. "She didn't say we couldn't go by car. Besides, she's overacting if you ask me." The Baroness's assistant then stood and informed the group that Major Reuter's body was being taken into Aleppo that day for burial. Colonel Holman of the Baghdad German police would be asking a few questions of the club members during the next several days. "Our friends, the Turkish officials here in Aleppo, are requesting that club members cooperate fully." A babble of low-toned conversation broke out around the tables. Allison hoped her tension didn't show, and she glanced across the dining room to where Helga Kruger sat near the screened window. Except for her commendable interest in archaeology, the Baroness was not the sort of woman that especially interested Allison. But after last night and the information Leia had given her, no one in the club was above suspicion, and particularly the German woman in her late 40s. Allison tried to recall the bits and pieces of information about Helga that had come her way the last several years. Baroness Kruger was the widow of a Berlin financier who had done much military contracting for Kaiser Wilhelm's government. The Baron had been killed in a training accident on the Berlin-Baghdad Railway in the mountainous territory of Bulgaria. Helga, relatively young and attractive, had never remarried, but had collected, so Sarah Blaine had told Allison, a huge fortune from military defense. With an interest in archaeology and Palestine, Baroness Kruger had first gone to Palestine. Baroness Kruger had first gone to Constantinople, where she entered the social scene, then moved to Cairo, where she came to be known as one of the most socially powerful of the Europeans. For the last several years, she had been deeply involved in buying Hittite sculptures and inscriptions for the Cairo Museum. She was competing with the representatives of the British Museum in Carchemish and elsewhere in Arabia. Neil had once mentioned in a letter to Allison that the Baroness was a friendly nemesis, and although an elegant woman of fashion, she was often seen being driven about the desert by her Turkish driver and a bodyguard, wearing trousers and boots and sporting a revolver. Yet when it came to archaeology, she embraced the club members of many countries and assumed a motherly attitude toward the younger women and men in the club. She traveled with a Turkish maid who styled Baroness Kruger's hair and applied her makeup for her. As a result, she appeared attractive in this bright, hot morning, while several other women in the party looked as if they'd already...
What kind of makeup could you...
As a result, she appeared attractive on this bright, hot morning, while several other women in the party looked as if they were already wilted from the heat. They fanned their haggard faces with beaded fans from Cairo. While the other women in the club were dressed casually for the wilderness environment, today Helga wore a simple but stunning pale green linen dress with a high neckline studded with flecks of emeralds. Looking at Baroness Kruger now, Allison decided there was more to Helga than her elegantly arranged blue-black hair and the fortune her husband had left her. The mouth, carefully painted with lipstick, had a somewhat bitter twist to it that no amount of makeup could hide. What does she have to be bitter about, wondered Allison. The death of her husband? Some secret pain? A charming piece of baggage, whispered General Blaine. I wonder if she's ever gives credit to her poor hubby when she drapes those emeralds and diamonds around her neck each morning. I heard she was a young dancer in a Berlin tavern when he picked her up and made her his elegant mistress.
Oh my.
Rex, Sarah Blaine mildly rebuked him. The pudgy Major General, who had retired from what was called the FNP, Foreign and Political Department in India, gave Allison a wink to show his remark was meant to be harmless after all, and gave her hand a fatherly pat. He then turned his attention back to his wife. Well, you can't blame me, Sarah. Being a goduncle to my angelic little Allison, I'm biased, indeed, when it comes to a shining example of what character ought to be. Now, Allison could wear emeralds and linen in the middle of the Arabian desert, and I'd believe in it. Allison laughed. I don't own any emeralds, Rex, and if I did, I wouldn't wear them on an expedition. She smiled at the older couple who had been friends of her parents since before she was born. Nothing General Blaine said scandalized her, for he was always jovial, and she took everything he said as coming from an affable personality. It looks as though you've been up late, he said. Trouble sleeping in these wretched huts? He looked at her curiously. Maybe we ought to return to Cairo. Oh, I wouldn't think of it, Allison assured him. There was a pause as if he waited for her to explain her mood this morning. It was on the tip of her tongue to tell him why she was in a downcast mood, and what had happened the night before in all its hideous vividness. But Leia's haunted face came to mind, and the warning she had given not to breathe a word of anything to anyone. While Allison completely trusted General Blaine and Sarah, she skirted the issue with a little yawn and looked around the table at what was for breakfast. You should have slept in, said Sarah. Did that Arab boy come banging on your door to make the bed? I told him to go away when he came to ours. It was dreadful. What you need, dear girl, is a swig of this, said the general, and poured Allison a cup of Quahwa? It's Qahwa. It's something Turkish. A special blend of supreme Turkish coffee.
Oh.
That sounds good, doesn't it? The Baroness, who is a self-proclaimed expert in all things Turkish, has arranged for the coffee to be served in style, he said lightly. There's sade, without sugar, ariha, little sugar, mazbat, medium sugar, and zayanda, syrupy. Allison smiled. I'll set it for black and strong this time. Sarah, how can you drink that syrupy brew as though you're enjoying it? And on an empty stomach, groaned Rex. And offend the Baroness by not doing it? Whispered the sprightly Sarah, a tiny woman with delicate gray at her temples. General Blaine affectionately called her his wee sparrow. Sarah leaned toward Allison, whom she looked upon as a niece, since she and the general had no children of their own, and whispered with wide eyes. This was the first time she has ever spoken to me, and she suggested I try it. I'd drink petrol if it meant she would notice me at last. I notice you, love. That's all that really matters, interjected Rex. Who do you think she's having at her Cairo home this Christmas holiday? She asked Allison. Listen to her, jested Rex. She's dying to let you know and pretends she's calm. Tell her, Sarah dear, before you burst. The Pharaoh himself. Aren't you impressed, Allison? Allison smiled as Sarah wrinkled her nose at her husband. Pharaoh indeed, but he might as well be. The Prince of Cairo, that's who, she told Allison. And this time I'm going to get an invitation to the Christmas party if it kills me. Such spoiled, snobbish inclinations you have, Sarah, said General Blaine. Well, go ahead and wrangle to get the invitation, and while you gaze starry-eyed at the Prince of Cairo, I'll collect a few Turkish cigars from her all-male get-together in the library. I hear she collects cigars and even smokes them. Rex, said Sarah in a half-scolding voice, you're positively houndish. She doesn't actually smoke cigars, does she? said Allison in a low, laughing voice.
I used to smoke Swisher Sweets.
She does indeed, said Rex, but he gave Allison a wink when Sarah glared at him. Allison recognized the too sweet dislike in General Blaine's voice when he spoke of the Baroness. As a retired officer in the British military, his scorn for what he called the war-hungry German Empire was well known to others, including the Baroness. Rex, how can you? Hissed Sarah. If she heard you, I'd never get an invitation. The end of the world as we know it, of course, he moaned in good humor. Then, for love of dear Sarah, I shall quite behave myself. He reached across the table for the serving plate of aish, bread stuffed with beaten rice and cream, and gibna, cream served warm and melted. He heaped 2 servings on his plate. About this old bone-digging holiday each year, the weather is atrocious, and the people positively ghoulish in their interest in dead things. But the food is tremendous. You can find it in Allison. She laughed. I've wondered why you didn't stay in Cairo, seeing how you loathe hiking out to the digs with Sarah and me. And you know the truth. I came because I heard the Baroness was in charge of the menu. He's a positive glutton, aren't you, darling? Said Sarah. But I love you just the same. After 20 years, he teased, and now that I've injured my back, I've got a good excuse to stay close to the hut. The blue bead must not be working after all. The blue bead? Asked Allison. Tell her, Sarah. I'm going to eat while I have a chance. Didn't you know? Said Sarah. Blue beads ward off the evil eye. The Arabs have them for their camels and donkeys, and even their houses have a blue painted strip. Look, isn't it a charming turquoise? Allison looked uneasily at the blue bead on the silver chain around Sarah's neck, but Sarah seemed to think it harmless. It's sweet, isn't it? Said Sarah. Rex bought it for me in the village last night. I was wondering where he had gone. Anything for my love. I'm totally sacrificial. Such nonsense, said Sarah. Not your dedication, Rex, she hastened. I mean, the notion that a blue bead can ward off evil. You don't believe that, do you? She asked Sarah. Sarah shrugged and lifted her aish to take a bite. Evil is more subtle, and personal, said Allison. Satan doesn't tremble at anything except... Now, interrupted General Blaine, lifting a square hand. This isn't Sunday morning, my dear. There'll be no preaching until I finish my breakfast. But maybe Major Reuter should have carried a blue bead. Might have saved him from that viper bite. Rex, I don't think you should be making a joke about death, said Sarah. It was a dreadful thing to happen. Even if he was... She is too generous. I'll finish her sentence for her. A soldier of Kaiser Wilhelm II, said Rex. I don't see how it could have been a viper, mused Allison, sipping her Turkish coffee. Why not? Said Sarah, interested, but General Blaine interrupted. Don't tell me you think he's been murdered too, he said to Allison. Too? You mean you do? She inquired, rather surprised. Heavens, no. Though I can see why a number of British fellows might want to do him in. And that odious and arrogant colonel from Baghdad, what is his name? Oh, yes, Holman. He glanced about. We haven't met the charming fellow yet. Rex, do lower your voice, begged Sarah. This isn't exactly British territory, you know. Of course it isn't. It's Turkish. A pity, too. So you think this was an accident? Asked Sarah. It's clear as they come, dear. Then I wish you'd explain it. It's horrible, I think. Horrible, yes. But quite understandable to one who knows. These desert critters. Take the boa, for instance, he suggested. You can have it, said Sarah, shivering. Don't you ever bring one of those things home for your odd collection of creatures. Of all reptiles, he continued, the cobra is perhaps the best known, and a spitting cobra is most remarkable of all. When the cobra strikes, it aims at its victim's eyes. It can spit its venom from its front teeth for distance up to 3 meters. Allison wanted to glance around the floor, and Sarah pushed away her half-eaten plate of food. Really, Rex, this whole matter is tasteless and disgusting after the man's death. Sorry, Sarah dear. Here, Allison, hand me the bowl of oranges. Allison thought of the bruise on the arm of the British agent masquerading as Major Carl Reuter. That plus the vein marks certainly hadn't come from 10 feet away, but she dare not mention it now, lest they wonder how she had seen the wound. She remembered something else about cobra she had learned in her medical training that General Blaine hadn't mentioned. A cobra, when it bites, uses a chewing action which destroys its fang marks, making it more difficult for a physician to know what manner of reptile had bitten his patient. She changed the subject. So you won't be coming with us on the hike to the digs because of your back? A nurse's heart to the rescue. It's about time one of you asked me how I felt. It's all Sarah's fault. She brought a trunk of clothes enough for a month, and guess who had to carry it for half a mile when our Mercedes broke it down? It's actually called Mercedes. It's German. Oh no, the car isn't working? Asked Allison. I was hoping Sarah and I could use it to drive out to the Carchemish digs. The club hasn't planned a trip until Thursday, and I'm worried about Cousin Neil. Another no-show, said General Blaine. Another? Thought Allison. Rex looked at his wife, who was still ashen after his discourse on the spitting cobra. Then you and Allison can borrow a vehicle from the British consul. I'll see what I can do after breakfast. Allison finished her meal in silence, wondering how she might smuggle something to Leia. Are you coming, Allison? Asked Sarah. Oh yes, the morning lecture. I'd forgotten about it. Who's to speak now that Neil is late? Do you know? Helga's assistant, the Turk, said General Blaine. His name is Jamal, Sarah said. A perfectly nice fellow. It should be interesting. Brought some Hittite things, said the general. Allison froze. Hittite things? I'll be a little late, she mentioned casually. Save me a good seat, will you? I've forgotten my sun hat. We'll save you the best seat in the house, said Rex. Come along, Sarah. Lead me to the lecture. I'm in the mood for a doze. When they had left and the others were drifting out of the dining hall in a murmur of low chatter, Allison glanced about. Seeing no one watching her, she quickly gathered fruit and bread and stuffed them inside her knapsack. On her way back to the hut, she stopped to look behind her, haunted by the notion that she was being watched by unseen eyes. Except for a few of the visitors on their way to the lecture, the glittering sweep of the sand-blanketed grounds were empty. The morning sunlight shimmered off the sand and heated the rocks and buildings like a furnace. She stood in the bowl-like yard with its half-circle of huts, all the windows looking down on her, and she could imagine Colonel Holman in one of those huts now, searching for incriminating evidence against a member of the club. As General Blaine had said, the colonel hoped to pin the death of his comrade on one of them. It was the way of this German secret police. Was he looking at her now through the window, or had he accompanied the Turkish officials into Aleppo for the burial of what he believed to be the remains of Major Carl Reuter? She felt a pang when she thought of the agent's true British family. Would they ever be told how he had met his death, or that he was buried somewhere in Arabia as a German soldier of the Kaiser? Probably not, she thought dismally.
Did somebody know?
Probably not. That's the way Allison knows it, is because Leia said he wasn't. Probably not, she thought dismally. Only God knew where he was, who he was, and who had murdered him. She shuddered and quickened her steps when a voice called, Allison. Baroness Helga Kruger walked toward her, wearing a wide-brimmed Australian hat, a rather unusual sight, considering the labors her maid must have gone through to do her hair in such stunning form. This was one of the few times Allison had actually spoken with a woman. Beneath the shadow of the hat, Helga's face, showing tiny lines of age, was taunt. Aren't you going to hear Jamal? Why, yes, I'd forgotten my hat, that's all. I can't imagine what has detained your cousin Neil, she mused, a small frown between her brows. He was just to arrive yesterday. Allison had the strange idea that Helga was waiting for her to respond and was curious what it would be. Don't you think someone should be sent to check on him? Anything might have happened. Trouble with his motor vehicle, perhaps, she added ambiguously. I'm told Colonel Holman is on his way in that direction. He left earlier this morning. Unfortunately, he left before I could speak with him. Colonel Holman, thought Allison. So he isn't here searching the huts? She thought to herself. Allison glanced about. Have you seen Leah? I noticed she didn't come to breakfast. When I knocked on her hut door this morning, no one answered. Most unusual for your cousin. She is quite professional. Caution, Allison warned herself. The deep, dark eyes alertly watched her. I talked with her yesterday, said Allison truthfully. She was worried about Neil. I'm sure she'll show up when she can. She has the tour to lead tomorrow to Aleppo. I hope she hasn't forgotten. It's so unusual for Leah. Helga gazed off across the grounds toward Leah's hut that was situated so the cooler early morning shadows shrouded it mysteriously. I'll try knocking again. If she doesn't enter this time, I think I shall use the master key. So she had a master key. The master key would work in each lock. There was nothing unusual about that, thought Allison, looking at the key ring that flashed in the sunlight since the Baroness had brought the compound from the Turkish officials in Aleppo. I fear the accident that took Major Ruder's life has upset her, Helga. It's upset us all. Helga turned a frank gaze upon her. I cannot help thinking they know each other. I don't see how that's possible, since Major Ruder came from Constantinople. Allison shifted her knapsack to the other arm and glanced about casually as though expecting someone to join them. I suppose you're right. I'd forgotten. He said he had been in Baghdad for 2 weeks. I admit I was not surprised he knew of our meeting and wished to attend. I didn't realize our club was becoming so well known. The meeting was in the Cairo paper, said Allison easily, adding, so as not to appear entirely closed to Helga's vague suggestion. But I see what you mean. Baghdad is rather far, isn't it? Did he say he read about it in the paper there? I had no time to inquire. He spoke to my assistant when he arrived. Helga turned to walk on without giving Allison time to answer, then stopped suddenly. Do you know someone broke into the Major's hut last night? The Arab boy found the lock broken this morning. He said the Major's belongings had been scattered about the hut. Allison felt as though she were under the even stare of a python. Believing that Helga knew Colonel Holman had spoken with her last night, she admitted, Yes, so Colonel Holman told me. Quite odd, isn't it? Helga's expression flickered with subdued satisfaction. A meticulously plucked brow lifted. He left for the Carchemish digs before either I or Jamal spoke with him about the matter. Then you saw him before he left. He told you about it. Curious that he would know. Allison looked at her, wondering how to slip out of her own noose. Helga went on smoothly. Then he knows. That is good. It means he will return to look into the matter. It was dreadful enough we met with an accident. If news gets out we had a burglary. It will generate bad publicity for the club. I mean, why would any of us wish to rummage through his belongings like that? Maybe it was just a petty thief who thought he might find a few things to sell at the bazaar in Aleppo. Most likely that's what it was, but none of my servants are thieves, she stated flatly. I didn't mean to imply. I hope whoever broke in was only that, a petty thief. What else could it have been? Asked Allison bluntly. Helga looked at her with fathomless dark eyes. I'm sure I don't know. Except the items a thief would usually take were all there. Jamal informs me nothing was missing. Of course your assistant would not know for certain unless he knew everything the Major had brought with him, and that isn't likely. Yes, you are right. We must wait until Colonel Holman returns. Allison hoped the Baroness didn't notice the flush that she felt warming her cheeks. Under Helga's level gaze, Allison turned to look toward her hut. I shall be anxious to know if you hear anything about Neil. I'm still hoping he'll arrive this morning. You'll let me know right away? Yes, and you will want to know about Leah as well. Yes, certainly. If you'll excuse me, I need to hurry. General Blaine and his wife are saving me a seat at the lecture. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Yes, I'm sure I will. Thank you. Allison was hurrying on when Helga called. If you have a copy of Woolley's book on archaeology, you will want to bring it with you since Jamal will refer to some of Woolley's notes on the Hittites. There was that word again, but the Baroness could not possibly be using it in the way Leia had informed her last night. There was nothing uncommon about referring to the Hittites, since the British Museum was exploring their ancient civilization at Durabalus. I don't have a Woolies book, Allison confessed. I couldn't find a copy to buy before I left Cairo. There seems to be a run on them. The book dealer was reordering from London when I left. The Baroness looked distracted as she stared across at Leia's vacant hut. She murmured something about getting more books for her own bookstore in Cairo from Constantinople, then walked briskly across the grounds. Allison looked after her uneasily, then turned and made for her own hut. The Baroness was suspicious. How much did she know? Perhaps more importantly, did her national loyalties lie with the territorial ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm? She was of German blood, but that was not enough cause to suspect her. It was unjust to brand every expatriate as a spy for Berlin. Patriot?
Yeah, expatriate.
Expatriate.
That's right.
General Blaine had said she was loyal to the Kaiser, but while Allison thought affectionately of the general, it was true that he was so starkly anti-German that his remarks bordered on being vicious. For the first time, Allison wondered what made his tongue so adder-like when it came to the Baroness. When she had an opportunity, she might ask Sarah. Allison entered the hut, bolted the door, and turned to the desk where Leia sat busily at work with pencil and paper. She looked up, the lines of weariness visible on her face. If only I'd had a minute longer in that hut, she sighed with exasperation and tapped the edge of the stubby pencil against the table. Hittite EBG. What was he telling me to look for? I wish I could be of more help. As it is, I brought the dining table. Here, nothing much to boast about, I'm afraid. Just some bread, cheese, and an orange. Sorry, no coffee, she asked as Leia's hopeful gaze flew to her hand. I'll try for coffee at lunch. As Leia peeled the orange, deep in thought, Allison stood watching her. You're trying too hard. Maybe you should let it go. Take a nap. You didn't sleep last night. I heard you walking about. There's no time to nap. If only Neil were here, he would know more to what to look for. And if he doesn't come at all? Whispered Allison. How long can we manage to hide you like this? The Baroness was on her way to your hut. You didn't show at breakfast, and everyone is beginning to ask. Leia looked at her worriedly. What of Colonel Holman? Did he go inside my hut? No, which seems unusual, seeing how ruthless he was in dealing with me last night. Helga says he's gone to Carchemish. The Terran is terribly suspicious that Neil hasn't shown up, and neither of you has led the club since Major Reuter met with his accident. Whatever happens, I'll need to know what Carl meant by this first word, and you'll need to keep convincing them there's nothing more in your mind than attending the expedition. Tomorrow is the excursion into Aleppo. You'll need to go and put up a good front. The thought made Allison uneasy. I hate to leave you here like this. If they decide to search, the Baroness has a key to all the huts. Why would she search? She has no reason to suspect I'm here, and Holman has already questioned you. I'm not so sure she isn't suspicious. She behaved oddly just now. The way she watched me and asked leading questions made me think she might be working with Holman. What do you know about Helga? Leia shrugged. You know the type. Wealthy, widowed, and bored. She has lots of money to play with, and unlike some women who prefer a round of parties, the Baroness is educated and interested in political dialogue. As I've said, she knows Neil and has brought pieces for the Cairo Museum. Naturally, she would be suspicious this morning. Carl's hut was broken into. No one knows where I am, and Neil hasn't shown himself. I suppose. She said Holman left early. Don't you think his behavior is strange? What do you mean? Allison was thoughtful. He said he thinks his colleague was murdered. So why would he leave before questioning the others in the club? Once we leave for British Cairo, he won't be able to interrogate anyone since he'll have no further jurisdiction. Yes, I see what you mean. I would have expected him to stay too, unless... Unless what? Asked Allison, alert. Leia sighed. I don't know. Do you think he suspects Neil? He may have gone to the digs to search for him. Neil is just one of the reasons he would go there. Leia glanced toward the door, then back at Allison. We've long suspected the Berlin-Baghdad railway is being built to haul German troops into Arabia. although the Kaiser denies this. Holman will meet with his contacts at the railway headquarters. I suspect he'll wire his superiors in Constantinople and inform them of Karl's death. But what if they wire back and say the real Karl Reuter is still in Constantinople? What if Karl Reuter himself wires back? That's part of the risk we take. I'm sure our side would have taken care of that possibility. Allison recognized the tension in Leia's voice. She wasn't sure at all, and that put even more pressure on her to come up with the coded word's meaning. Tell me again what you saw in Major Reuter's hut, pressed Leia. I've told you everything. There was nothing but his satchel of papers, his clothing, and that's just it, she insisted. If the clue is something he hid in his clothing, you'll never know what it is. No, Reuter was too careful. He would know I wouldn't have time to search his things. The paper was on his desk in plain sight, and he would make anything else visible as well, but just as unlikely to draw attention from the enemy. She stood restlessly. Think, Allison. Are you quite certain you saw nothing else while sitting in the chair under Holman's questioning? Allison walked to the small window and drew aside the curtain, thinking, as she tried to do all morning. Even at breakfast, while General Blaine and Sarah chatted, her mind had revisited the dreadful room. Yet all she saw in her memory was Colonel Brent Holman, his riveting blue stare and his arrogant stance, as he insisted she had stolen important information from Karl Reuter. She let the curtain fall back into place. I must go. Helga has left your hut and is walking back toward the main building. I don't want her to catch me just coming out. I've taken too long to get my hat. She snatched it from the peg and opened the door, letting in a path of sunlight. I'll keep thinking, and I'll be back after lunch. Leia smiled unexpectedly but tiredly. Get that coffee this time, will you? I promise, Allison responded. She stepped out, turned the key in the lock, and waited a second until she heard Leia slide the bolt into place. Even if the Baroness made up some excuse to use her master key while she was away, she couldn't get inside. But Allison would need to do some explaining of how she managed to bolt the door from the outside. She was coming down the steps, strapping on her hat, when a man's voice spoke from the side of the hut. So there you are. I've been looking for you. Her heart jumped to her throat, and she turned rigid. David. Dun, 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 dun. Chapter 5. Allison looked at him dazed. She was so surprised to see the young Jewish activist she had met in London at Oswald Chambers Bible Training College. He stood below the porch in the hot sand, wearing khaki knee pants, leather boots, and the traditional helmet-like expedition hat made of canvas. She hardly recognized him out of London dress and noted that he also sported a rifle slung over his shoulder. A kit bag sat at his feet containing his clothing. He obviously intended to stay a while. David, she breathed, I thought you left London when I did, that you had gone home to South Africa. What on earth are you doing here? He grinned. On earth? Where would a Jew feel more at home than in Palestine? I ask you. This is Aleppo, she stated. You are not in Jerusalem, and the Turks are questioning anyone who even hints of knowing David Ben-Gurion. He shrugged his heavy shoulders with a determination she had come to recognize. Well, then I'm safe for the moment. I haven't met Ben-Gurion yet. She got the meaning to the word yet. Then he had made up his mind, she thought. His politics had convinced him to involve himself on the side of the Zionist movement in Jerusalem. You're risking your life, you know, she said quietly. His brown eyes turned serious. Some things are worth the risk. A homeland is one of them, he smiled again. But we've wasted nearly 2,000 years. I can wait a few more weeks. I came to see you. I heard in Cairo you were here. His eyes laughed at her. Still in your biblical archaeology, are you? Still into your biblical archaeology, are you? She came down the steps and they walked slowly toward the main buildings. What are you doing here in Cairo? Did you go by to see my family? They would have enjoyed meeting you. I told them how you braved the BTC to argue religion and politics with Oswald Chambers and some of the students. Ah, Daniel in the lion's den, he jested. And like him, I came out without a scratch. She smiled. David had a pleasant way about him, even as he aired his doubts that Jesus was the promised Jewish Messiah. Many of the Christian students, as well as Chambers, had warmly befriended him, and the friendship deepened during the 2 months in which David had come to the large house turned into a college by Oswald Chambers and his wife Betty. Allison would never forget the rainy Christmas Eve when he had arrived with Wade Finley, another BTC student. David had appeared the traditional activist, ready to argue into the late hours of the night to prove his new friends wrong. When Chambers had not wished to argue but had befriended the young man who was away from his home in South Africa, David had been content to leave the topic of Jesus and discuss the eye of a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine. He had met Lord Balfour, so David told them, and Chaim Wiseman. Chaim Wiseman. Chaim Wiseman.
Very famous.
And David planned to contact Zionists who were living and working in Jerusalem. David Ben-Gurion was the head of a Jerusalem group that was trying to gain some semblance of independence from the Turks. David's dream was to join them. So you're going to Jerusalem, she asked. I'm convinced our time has come. I have a plan to meet a friend here first. Perhaps you know him. He's done some work in archaeology as well. Minor stuff, so he says. He's never one to boast. I met him in London at a Zionist meeting. He's Jewish? No. He's as British as they come, but he's on our side, he grinned. He can wax more eloquent than I when it comes to touting reasons for a Jewish homeland. He was at the meetings, I think, just to look us over for future harvesting. Harvesting? The war. It's coming, you know. A cloud settled over her emotion. A war would ruin the medical missionary work with Aunt Lydia on the Mercy. War is inevitable, she insisted. Don't be a desert ostrich. There's no stopping the ambitions of Germany. It's Germany's time, as they say. They were flat on the side of Austria and her move to annex Serbia, and if the Russian Tsar Nicholas intervenes on behalf of Serbia, it'll be the excuse the Kaiser is looking for to join Austria and declare war, not only on Serbia and Russia, but also on France and England. And Arabia will be in the thick of the battle. Allison feared he was right. Why Arabia? Because of the oil reserve? That has a lot to do with it, he lowered his voice. Why else would they be building the railway from Baghdad to Palestine? Access to oil and troop movements. Yes, but the Turkish controls Arabia, and they're unlikely to side with the Kaiser, but rather with England. And not everyone agrees that war is inevitable, she protested. Why, even now, the heads of government are negotiating, trying to work out peace over the Balkan War. The Kaiser doesn't want peace, he said with a touch of scorn. Austria annexing Bosnia was just beginning. The Kaiser and his war minister have been preparing for years, building masses of weapons in secret, including some of the biggest guns ever. Howitzers, with shells that can flatten a city, David scowled to himself. I say they have St. Petersburg in mind, while the rest of Europe dozes like an old man in the sun. Germany's army of reserves, numbering 2 million, is preparing for battle at a day's notice. He looked at her and gave her an apologetic smile. There I go again. If I were smart, I wouldn't always talk war when I see you, would I? She smiled and said nothing. By the way, he said, that reminds me. I brought you a letter, you see. There are other reasons I've come. Here, from your other admirer, Wade Finley. She laughed. So you came all the way to Arabia to play postman, did you? I hardly believe it, but thanks just the same. She took the letter and placed it unopened in her kit bag. Aren't you going to read it? He teased. A love letter from your greatest admirer. No, I shouldn't say greatest. She pretended she hadn't noticed his intent. Never mind about Wade, so tell me about this friend of yours you've come here to meet. Who is he? Brett Holden. Startled, she looked at him. What did you say? Brett Holden, he repeated. Why? She shook her head, relieved. No reason. I thought you said someone else. Brett is expecting me, though I have a way of showing up unexpectedly and dropping my bag on someone's doorstep. What I have to talk to him about may gain me a warm welcome. She looked at him and noted his tan face had grown grave. The determination she had come to recognize was visible in his eyes. "Sounds rather mysterious," she said quietly. He shrugged. "I heard in Cairo that this club is the biggest in Arabia." "It is the biggest," Allison responded, letting him change the subject. "Several experts are here this year. I don't know everyone," she admitted. "There are some new faces. If anyone would know where to find your friend, it would be the secretary of the club, Baroness Helga Kruger." "Ah, yes, the wealthy German widow." "You know her?" she asked curiously. "No, heard of her. Who hasn't?" "I'll introduce you to her at lunch. You are staying?" "Until tomorrow. If Brett's not here, I'll drive on up to the Carchemish digs at Durables. He's a friend of the archaeologist Woolley and his assistant T.E. Lawrence." Woolley and Lawrence, along with Neil and Leia, worked for the British Museum at Carchemish. "Neil is at Carchemish too, isn't he?" he asked blandly. At the mention of her cousin, her concerns came back to plague her. She watched David with subdued caution. She would like to tell him about Leia, yet it would be unwise without first asking her. "Yes, Neil has been here to lecture on the newest finds," she explained. "He's been delayed." "Nothing serious?" I don't know. He may come in today." She looked at him sideways as they walked slowly toward the lecture hut. "This friend of yours, Brett Holden, the one you met at the Zionist meetings in London, what makes you think he's here?" He shrugged. "I was told rather hush in Cairo that I might find him if I inquire from Neil at the digs. I stopped here first, thinking I might save time since they might be with the club, and because I knew you were here." He watched her. "I've missed you." She made no reply. While David was attractive and she admired his dedication to help establish a Jewish colony in Jerusalem, she was even more concerned about his coming to recognize the Messiah. She hadn't said anything to him, but David's name was written in a journal Oswald Chambers gave her as a going away present when she left his school in London. "Be totally his," Chambers had told her in that simple and sweet way that said so much of the man's own relationship with Christ. David's name was written down with several others for whom she prayed each Sunday afternoon when she gave herself to Bible reading and rest. How could she help him see that it was possible to remain a Jew and believe in Yeshua? He had several times used the argument that Jesus is for Goim, the Gentiles. Goim, the Gentiles. No. Any romantic interest must not grow, she told herself firmly. David must remain only a friend. Anyway, there was Wade Finley, she reminded herself, a young man she had met at Chambers College. "Have you heard of Brett Holden before?" David asked. She tried to place the name. It sounded a little like Holman. But in thinking of the ruthless German colonel, she dismissed the ideas. "No, but that isn't to say Professor Holden isn't here. As I've said, there are several new faces this year, including a professor from Constantinople." He frowned. "If I don't find him, I'll drive on to Durables. He's likely to be poking around the Hittite palace there. Brett is especially interested in anything Hittite." He said, there was that word again, but did it mean anything coming from David? Well, what had Leia told her? It would be left to the agent trying to get in touch with her and Neil to make the first contact. He would disclose himself in such a way as not to breed suspicion from curious onlookers. David certainly didn't seem like an agent, but who was Brett Holden? Was he a true professor, or was it a cover? She must mention this possibility to Leia. As for David, who would suspect a Jew interested in Zionism to work primarily for the British government? But she knew David. At least she told herself she did, and he did not seem the type to be Neil's superior in the British intelligence. His political fires were smoldering in the cause for a Jewish homeland, and his spirit found no rest in any cause that did not benefit the rallying call of next year in Jerusalem. "Neil is my cousin," she stated. "I didn't know you knew him. You never mentioned him at BTC, and I don't recall having told you about him or his line of work for the museum." "Oh, didn't I?" he said casually. "Well, I've never met him personally. Brett told me about him. Said he was a Hittite expert." Everything pointed to David being the new contact sent in an emergency to see Leia. But if that were so, why had he been in London, and why had he involved himself in the Zionist meeting? Had he gone there as a spy seeking contacts to aid the British in Arabia should war actually break out? It was also strange that the man named Brett Halden had attended those meetings, and as David hinted, was there harvesting for the future war needs. Allison remained silent, wondering if she dared mention Leia, and that she waited in secret to make contact with the agent who would take the place of the murdered Major Carl Reuter. But to blurt it out was so little to go on was foolish. She trusted David, and she admitted that when she first saw him, she had felt a wave of relief, for she had thought that here was a man to whom both she and Leia could turn to for help. But she must say nothing until she talked with Leia after lunch. She took David's arm and edged him forward. "We're late. Let's hurry. So Brett Halden knows my cousin Neil?" Brett said they met 2 years ago in Constantinople. Neil was there about a Hittite sculpture piece at the museum. Come to think of it, it had something to do with Baroness Kruger and her work for the Turkish Museum. There was a dispute over who should have the piece. Neil claimed she had swiped it away from the digs without his knowing. Lawrence especially was upset about it. "Don't look now, but here comes Helga," whispered Allison.
You've heard of that story.
"And David, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't let it be known why you're here. Say you came to see me, would you?" He looked at her, a hint of surprise in his brown eyes. As Baroness Kruger walked toward them, he smiled and gave a wink. "Don't worry." "A new visitor, Allison. I don't think we've met." Helga turned her steady dark eyes on David and extended a firm, bejeweled, feminine hand. "I'm Baroness Kruger, secretary to the Archaeological Club. You've come up from Cairo." David could be all charm when he chose to be, and he was now bending over her hand as though he himself were a German count dressed in regal splendor. "Professor David Goldstein, from New York. I'm on tour." "Professor?" Allison tried to mask her unease over David's pretense. "Splendid. You've come with credentials, of course," came Helga's smooth voice. "Now what?" thought Allison. But David smiled, outwardly unaffected by the Baroness's icy greeting and her obvious skepticism. "I never travel without papers, Baroness, but I confess I didn't expect to be digging them out now, in the middle of the grounds. We're already late for the lecture. Your assistant is speaking, isn't he? Professor Jamal Pasha of Cairo University. If you insist." "I would not insist." "The height of rudeness, Professor Goldstein. It can wait for a more convenient time. You understand the embarrassing pressure put upon me by the Turkish officials of Aleppo. Anyone with a Jewish name is immediately suspected of Zionist temperament. And sure to stir up trouble, yes."
Yeah.
Her eyes flickered at his casual insolence. "The Turkish officials have insisted we limit membership to our club to fair race. Yes, I understand, Baroness, and I wouldn't want to embarrass you by insisting I be admitted to the club because of my credentials. I was here merely to see an old friend before passing on to Cairo." He gestured his chestnut-colored head toward Allison. "Nurse Allison Westcott. We met in London." Allison's gaze had dropped, and she felt the warm color of indignation rise in her face over the Baroness's blatant anti-Semitism.
Anti-Zionism.
Nope. S-E-M.
Oh, anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Yeah.
But meeting David's eyes, she saw he understood and did not wish to make a point of it. "In that case, you're quite welcome to stay, Professor Goldstein. Nevertheless, friend of Allison's or not, we will need to see your papers. You understand, of course. It isn't my ruling." "Your good intentions are quite understood, Baroness." Although Helga turned her gaze on Allison and smiled, her eyes did not. "The real reason I've come to let you know that your cousin Leia is not at her hut. And it appears she left in a hurry. She took nothing with her, not even a change of clothing. Her things have been ransacked. Someone broke into her hut the same way they did Major Reuter's. Very odd. The question is, why?" Allison masked a river of alarm. Whoever murdered Carl Reuter had seen Leia pick up the piece of paper from the floor, and now he had searched her hut. I think I should contact the Turkish police at once," said Helga. "What's this?" asked David, looking from Helga to Allison. "A burglar? A burglar in the club? Now this is something to talk about. Looking for rare pieces to sell, perhaps?" "I hardly think so," said Helga coolly. "We've had a death," explained Allison. An accident, insisted Helga. A German officer from Baghdad, Major Karl Reuter. The burglary, if it is that, has nothing to do with the accident. Allison watched David's response to the Major's name, hoping to see a faint glimmer of recognition linking them as friendly agents. If he had been sent to replace the supposed Karl Reuter, he would know about the Major's death. What kind of accident? A victim of the Cobra, said Helga, looking about the desert absently. I was asking Allison earlier if her cousin Leia might have taken his death hard and gone back to the expedition house at Durabulas, especially since Neil hasn't shown up either. If she had gone back, hastened Allison, she'd meet up with Colonel Holman. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. Yet none of the servants mentioned seeing Leia leave. That she didn't take her clothing is suspicious, so I went to check the vehicle she arrived in. Her dark eyes glinted smugly. It's still parked under the acacia tree. So she can hardly have left. She must be somewhere. Acacia tree. So she can hardly have left. She must be here somewhere. Allison remained expressionless. I'm on my way now to speak to the security man, Helga said. A second viper bite does not seem out of the ordinary, coming so soon after the first, doesn't it? Yes, murmured Allison. It would be odd indeed. Helga looked at her and her expression changed. About that archaeology book by Woolley, she said thoughtfully. The one on the Hittites. I'm afraid I won't be able to loan it to you after all. I remember on my way to Leia's hut that I had lent it to Major Reuter when he first arrived. He was admiring my library and asked for it specifically, said he had so much reading to do before listening to this year's lectures. He was looking forward to the excursion out to the digs. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to enjoy it. Allison blinked. She was remembering something she had seen in the hut. The book she had knocked to the floor, simply and appropriately titled The Hittites. Her heart began to beat faster. Of course, Major Reuter could have left his message for Leia in the Hittite book. It was David who spoke. Woolley's book on the Hittite discovery. It's quite excellent. Matter of fact, I brought along a copy. He looked at Allison. I'll lend you mine. That would be good of you, said Helga. Everything in Major Reuter's hut is being held for investigation until his death is cleared as an accident. So, the book was still in the hut. Helga had turned and walked away, bent on finding the private security guard she had hired for the club meeting. Soon there would be a full-fledged search for Leia, and who knew where it would lead? Allison couldn't take the chance that her hut would be searched. Leia must escape, but how could she get a hold of that book from Major Reuter's hut first? Allison had another thought. What if the murderer realized the item he was looking for was not with Leia, but remained in the hut? Something wrong, Allison? Asked David quietly. I'm worried about Neil's absence. It isn't like him to be irresponsible. He knew he had to this morning's lecture. He may have been held up at Carchemish for some reason. No use jumping to the worst conclusions. And Leia may have gone there to find him. I wish it were as simple as that, she said in a low voice. What's this? You don't think so? Something going on I don't know about. David, did you say you were driving up to Durabulas to meet Professor Holden? Yes, I was thinking of leaving in the morning if he isn't here. And from the warm welcome of Her Majesty, I can see I won't be invited to take a hut. I'd like to ride up with you, if you would let me. Sure, we'll leave now if you want. I have a motorbike. He took her in cautiously. Think you can ride in back? I could, but there's no need. Baroness Kruger mentioned Leia's Mercedes parked here near here. It will get us there more quickly. What about the keys? Leia had them, of course, but Allison knew she couldn't admit that yet. Don't worry about that. I'll come up with them. I'd rather leave after dinner when it's dark, if you don't mind. He watched her curiously. I gather there is more to this than wishing to avoid the heat. Well, actually, there is. And there's also something I must do first. David, I'd appreciate it tremendously if you didn't mention this to anyone just yet. Not until we get back. If you want it that way, why not? I suppose you'll tell me what's going on soon enough. Trust me until I can. Trust you, a noble nurse serving God and country aboard the Mercy, explicitly. Do you really have Woolley's book, or was that just to save me from the silence about to swallow me up? I gathered something she said startled you, so I thought I'd better come to your rescue. Then you don't have a copy? No. Is it important? No, not that one. She studied his face. David, are you a British agent? He laughed. What a bizarre question. One you're not answering. Then I'll answer plainly. No, he sobered. Not yet. Not yet. She glanced at him as they hurried toward the door into the lecture hut. She remembered what he had said about the Zionist meeting in London being a place that could be harvest in case war came. Harvest, she assumed, by the British foreign officer for the act of spying. But wouldn't that also point to Professor Brett Holden being connected with the espionage since she had gone to the meetings to look for possible future spies? Her mind spun with too many possibilities, and she saw that David was watching her. She quickened her pace. We're dreadfully late. As she and David neared the hut, they could hear the deep Turkish voice of Jamal Pasha, assistant to the Baroness, discussing the latest discovery of a large stairway to a palace at Carchemish. Jamal had always been a curious entity as far as Allison was concerned. He was an expert in ancient Egypt mummies and besides working in the summer for the Baroness, was a professor at the Cairo Archaeological School. He looked to be in his 30s and was tall and thin with stooped shoulders. He had magnificent eyes so large that the whites showed oddly against his swarthy face. Through an open window from where Jamal's voice floated out, she saw General Blaine's reddish-gray hair turn to look out at the sound of their footsteps on the gravel. "Who's that?" David asked, when the general gave her a friendly scowl at being more than 20 minutes late. She smiled. "General Blaine. He's here as a spectator with his wife, Sarah. They're close friends of my parents. It's Sarah who's the archaeology enthusiast. General Blaine devotes himself to other interests." David followed her inside, and since only one chair had been saved, he was about to take a seat in the back. General Blaine stood, beckoning for David to take his, and whispered as they came up, I've had all I can take on old bones and dirt. I'm going back to my hut to rest my back until lunch." Allison smiled and took her seat, David beside her. She leaned over to Sarah. "Have I missed much?" "I've taken notes. You can copy them tonight," Sarah hissed, and then added, "Where did that husband of mine go?" "To lie down and rest his back. It's just as well. We're all going to Aleppo this afternoon. The bazaar shops there are wonderful." The rest of the morning passed without incident. Allison was anxious to return to her hut to report to Leah, but she had to be careful to avoid being seen. As they broke for lunch, she excused herself from David and Sarah and made a quick return to where Leah hid. Allison entered breathlessly. "I think we may have our answer to the message Reuter left you on his desk." Leah stood tersely. She bolted the door and drew Allison aside. "What happened?" she whispered anxiously. Allison explained about Reuter's borrowing the Hittite book from Helga. Leah's breath came rapidly. "Yes, a book would work. Do you know the title?" "The Hittites." "It must be what you're looking for. Besides, I remembered after Helga mentioned it that I had knocked it off a table when Colonel Holman sneaked up behind me." Leah took hold of Allison's arm so tightly that she winced. "That's it. It must be. I have to get back inside that hut. Is it under guard now?" "No, there's no one. I was careful to look as I went by. Do hurry. We've little time. The Baroness is driving into Aleppo to report you missing along with Neil. By tomorrow, they'll surely search all the huts." Excuse me. Leah nodded. I'll get in the hut tonight, when everyone is in the dining room having supper. 2 Turkish security guards are roaming the grounds. I'll watch, but I'll need to risk it. That book is crucial, and someone else is alert for possibilities. Did anyone hear Helga mention it? No, just a Jewish friend of mine, David Goldstein. Leah's gaze came alert. Yes? Allison thought back to the open window in the lecture hut. We were standing a bit away from the lecture hut, but the door and the windows were all open to let in a breeze. Jamal Pasha was lecturing, and the club members were taking notes and listening. Still, we can't be sure of that. Helga didn't seem concerned about lowering her voice. Then getting in the hut is urgent. I dare not wait. Where are you going now? To lunch? Good. Everyone else is likely to be there too. Leah looked at her evenly. I'm going to try now, during lunch. You can't, not in broad daylight. It's a chance I must take. You can keep an eye out on at the dining room. I'll wait for 15 minutes after the lunch bell sounds. Everyone will be there, and I'll go to the hut. If the book is where Carl left it, I will find it within a few minutes. It's too risky. Anything could go wrong. Sit where you can see both doors. And Allison, if anyone should decide to leave early before the others, it will end up to you to join them. Make a scene outside, scream about seeing a cobra, do anything, but raise your voice so I can hear you. All right, I'll try, but you can't stay here much longer. David and I will get you safely out of here before Colonel Holman returns or the Turkish inspector arrives from Aleppo. Leah sank into the chair. This Jewish friend of yours, David Goldstein, can he be trusted? Allison explained their relationship in London at Oswald Chambers Bible Training School. We can trust him. I'll stake my life on it. You may have to. We both may. Allison waited until the lunch bell sounded, then walked slowly across the sand toward the dining room where the club members were all drifting in. Talking of Jamal's lecture, she waited until the last person had gone in through the door, then followed, her heart thumping. Sarah and David were seated at a table near the front door, and Allison looked about casually as if deciding on a seat. All the seats were taken except for 4 at the table where Sarah sat, beckoning her. While scanning the faces present, Allison was convinced no one suspected that Major Carl Reuter was murdered, or that Leia was safely hidden in Allison's hut. Where is Rex Blaine? David excused himself from the table. Allison's gaze followed him anxiously, but he was making the rounds of the 6 different tables, boldly introducing himself as Professor Goldstein from New York. If the situation she was in had not been so serious, Allison would have found his daring amusing. She guessed that Allison was making the rounds because he was still on the lookout for Professor Brett Holden. But whether or not David had found him was uncertain. Her tension grew. Neither Baroness Helga Kruger nor her assistant, Professor Jamal Pasha, had shown up in the dining room. She wondered if this meant they had paid a visit to the Turkish police or whether they were watching Reuter's hut. From her chair, Allison could see the outline of her hut and Major Reuter's. Was Leia making her move now? She had said she would wait 15 minutes after the bell rang. Sarah Blaine was in an animated conversation with several others at the table about the wonderful bargains they could locate at the bazaar. I'm going to try my hand at sewing a kaftan. How about you, Allison? Say, are you listening? Don't tell me you're still dreaming about Jamal's lecture. Oh, here he is now, and the Baroness herself. Allison's breath paused with relief as she looked from the window, surprised to see Helga and Jamal stopping at their table. They seemed to have emerged from nowhere. Now everyone was accounted for. Is everyone accounted for? She dressed at the clock on the wooden wall. 15 minutes past 12. Oh, please do join us, she breathed with a welcoming smile. And while Jamal bowed slightly and gestured at the empty seat beside her, Helga declined. Watching David, who was seated by Mr. Blackstone from the Cairo Museum, she walked in that direction. The seat? You're saving it for your friend from New York? Inquired Jamal too politely. No, please sit down, said Allison, keeping an eye on Helga. David seems to have pulled up a chair at the other table. I apologize for entering your lecture late, Professor. I was looking forward to hearing you. His wide mouth beneath the Turkish black mustache seemed to spread reluctantly into a smile that matched his angular. Allison didn't think Jamal smiled very often. When he did, it was almost done with an apology. His large eyes looked at her kindly, though sadly, like reflective pools. Then you will have an opportunity to attend again, Nurse Westcott. Unfortunately, if your cousin Neil does not arrive, I will be obligated to take tomorrow's lecture as well. You don't enjoy lecturing, Professor? It's understandable, of course. I'm sure you weren't expecting to fill in like this. I don't mind filling in, since Carchemish is providing some interesting finds. As you may know already, I am an Egyptianologist. She did know this, and wondered why he was so closely associated with the Baroness, whose main interest was archaeology. It's Neil we are wondering about, he said. We sent 2 men last night to check the road to Aleppo. They found no sign of your cousin. The Baroness tells me Miss Leia also is absent. I thought you would like to know that we've notified the authorities in Aleppo. They will arrive by dinner tonight. We will need to search all the huts. What's this? Asked Sarah, evidently overhearing and coming to attention. Something happened to your cousin, Allison. We don't know yet. She wasn't in her hut this morning, and the Baroness and Professor Pasha are rather concerned. As well they might be. Good heaven, a young woman wouldn't simply wander off all alone in the desert. Leia might, said Jamal with a wan smile. She is adventurous and intelligent. So if she did, I wouldn't worry too much about her abilities to care for herself. Allison watched him over her hot bayana tea with mint and wondered how much he knew about Leia. I hope this doesn't ruin our jaunt to the bazaar, said Sarah with a thoughtful frown. I wanted yards of red silk to make a kaftan. I'm afraid you'll be delayed, he said apologetically. The police will want to question everyone about what they saw when they saw Miss Bristol lost. Jamal watched Sarah Blaine over his cup. I haven't seen her at all, said Sarah with a brisk wave of her hand when a voice interrupted. Forgetful darling Sarah. We spoke to her when we arrived yesterday afternoon, said General Blaine. He groaned as he pulled out a chair and sat down beside his wife. It was soon after the Arab boy reported the death of the German officer Reuter. Oh, you're right, said Sarah, looking embarrassed at her omission. Rex is right. She was coming out of the common room, or was it from the acacia tree? Acacia tree? How do you say it? Acacia tree. Acacia trees. I spoke to her, but she didn't appear to notice. Preoccupied with her duties as club hostess, I suppose. Or preoccupied with the death of Major Reuter. Well, the lass is missing now, said Major Blaine, motioning to the servant to pour his coffee. Add a bit of hot water to it, would you, old boy? Stuff is strong enough to curl my hair on top, if I had any. He looked about, his sleepy pale gray eyes suddenly curious as they fixed on Professor Jamal Pasha. Our sprightly holiday is turning into a regular mystery. Where can she be? What have you, Allison? Any idea? He asked as his eyes shifted to her. I'm quite sure nothing has happened to her, said Allison. Professor Pasha is right when it comes to my cousin's adventurous spirit. Most likely she went searching for Neil. A brave woman. You wouldn't catch me out in the desert by myself. The heat, the scorpions, the Bedouin. Not a place for a lone woman, I would say. Well, we'll soon find out, said the general with a sigh. Here comes the Baroness, looking grim and determined. You must lead an unfortunate life of nerves, Jamal, working so closely with Helga. The look that passed Jamal's gaunt, dark face gave Allison a shiver. For a moment, she'd seen a flicker of hate flash in his usually expressionless face. And there was no mistaking on whom that hatred was fixated. Not on General Blaine for his goading mistake, but on Baroness Helga Kruger herself. Chapter 6. Helga's blue eyes burned intensely, and a flush of excitement warmed her face. We've done it, Allison. We've outsmarted them. There's nothing left now except to turn the information over to Neil. Leia had carefully hidden the book before Allison ever returned from the dining room, and Allison knew better than to ask her where it was. Leia trusted her, but she couldn't tell Allison everything, nor
She got over there?
Leia trusted her, but she couldn't tell Allison everything, nor did Allison expect Leia to. Therefore, Allison was surprised when Leia said, I've heard from Neil. Everything is going to be all right. Neil? Allison nearly choked. Leia nodded. I'm meeting him tonight. Allison watched her, unable to move, as the meaning of her cousin's words sank into her mind. She could see Leia was more relaxed than she remembered seeing her since the club meetings had begun. Leia's eyes almost sparkled with youth. Are you sure? Allison asked. You're not mistaken. How? Leia glanced about as if deciding. All right, I'll tell you what I can. Sitting in the chair by the desk and speaking in a carefully guarded tone so as not to say more than aloud, Leia told Allison how she had first been sent to Durables from Bombay to contact and take orders from Professor Neil Bristow, who, since he was her brother, seemed the perfect partner in intelligence gathering. They could trust each other explicitly, and no one would suspect them of working for the British government. Since Leia had always been interested in writing, it was her job to store up the archaeological information for the British Museum, and because Neil was also working privately on a book about the discovery of the Hittites, her presence appeared beneficial to both the family and the museum. Between us, she said in a low voice, we were able to find out what we had been sent to learn about the railway. Only Carl had discovered something even more important. He had hot information for London and couldn't get through. He knew he was being watched. Leia stated all this unemotionally, and Allison leaned forward in excitement.
As you know, someone knew Carl was British and murdered him before he could meet with Neil as planned. But Neil was alerted ahead of time, almost at the last minute, and his orders were to avoid the meeting. Unfortunately, Carl was trapped. Thank heaven he must have realized a short time before he was murdered that things had gone badly. Earlier, the espionage situation had progressed to a higher level than either Neil or Leia was equipped to handle, and the lurking menace at the Carchemish digs, and now here at the huts in Aleppo, had made it necessary for Carl to risk meeting Neil. Neil was to pass on the information to someone in higher authority. We were to use the cover of the Aleppo Archaeological Club to meet and receive the information from Major Reuter. But everything went wrong, as we both know. How did German intelligence in Baghdad learn that Carl was a British agent? The same way we find out things. People who are least suspected are spies. But like with Carl, the role often leads to death. And Neil's superior? Neil sent off a call for help, knowing I was probably trapped here and unable to show myself, yet still responsible. Now, Neil had to stay hidden, even as Leia did. Visitors were arriving by the score on the railway near the Carchemish digs, and many came to see the finds. Neil's new contact would come this route, affording himself a cover into Baghdad. The Berlin-Baghdad railway, thinking of it, brought Allison a shiver. Then he came, she asked in an excited whisper. Yes, he's here. Neil will meet him soon. It's the other agent's headache now, but there's something left for me to do tonight, something important. The day was drawing to a close outside the window, and the silence and the brooding desert wind seemed to take a step closer to the hut. I'm to bring Neil the information Carl left me, and then Neil will meet with his superior. Allison stirred. Bring him Wooly's book. Neil doesn't know yet that it's Wooly's book. He thinks Carl left the information in written form. To have done so would be a mistake, of course, and few agents would risk it, but Carl was in a desperate situation, so it's conceivable. I'm letting Neil think so as a safeguard on my part. You mean you don't trust Neil? Gasped Allison, somewhat indignantly. Of course I trust him, Leia laughed. He's my brother. Even among agents, we have our orders not to take any chances. Don't look so worried. He would want me to be careful. I won't feel like I'm out of this until the book is in Neil's hands. Allison's concerns grew, even though Leia would know better than she what actions were expected of her. Have you looked at the book? Do you know the message Major Reuter left? Leia shook her head. I wouldn't know what to look for, but Neil does. The less I know, the better it will be for all of us. There's less chance of making a mistake, of falling into the hands of the other side. Even if I were so unlucky, I couldn't tell him a thing. So it's the book that's actually all important. There would be no reason for them to end your life the way they did Major Reuter's? She smiled. I'm counting on that. I feel matters are safer now that Neil has contacted me. He wouldn't have expected me to meet him if there were much chance of my being caught on the way. Allison glanced about as though the silent shadows were listening enemies. You're certain the message was from Neil? She smiled. Quite certain. I'd never risk meeting him if I weren't. Still, she agreed, I'll need to be on watch. Don't look so worried. I plan to bring a sheaf of phony documents with me just to make a good cover. I won't produce the book until I'm certain it's Neil and someone isn't hiding with a revolver trained on him. Then Leia had thought about the possibility. I don't like it, Allison said. But it sounds as if you know what you're doing. How did you hear from him? I didn't say anything before, but the Arab boy is on our side, she said simply. A number of them are friendly with the British, and you might as well know. In the message, Neil told me he was the third man we heard in that hut that night. Neil? Allison whispered. Is it possible? But I called out. Why didn't he answer? Leia stood. He didn't dare. Anyone else may have been listening. It was far wiser to slip away and send the call for help to his superior, which is what he did. Remember, I didn't answer you either. Thank God things have worked out. Yet Allison's foreboding continued. Despite Leia's explanation and her confidence, something was not quite right. Allison couldn't place her finger on it, but it weighed darkly in the back of her mind. Something she should know, that Leia should have understood but had overlooked. Leia, however, appeared confident. If the experts in subversive activities are satisfied, thought Allison, who am I to argue with their decisions? I'm a nurse, not a spy, and the sooner I get back to Cairo, the better.
Then, mused Allison, Neil knew that Major Rooter was murdered. He was here that night, but couldn't show himself. He hid until he could enter the hut to find the message left for him in an inconspicuous way. She looked at Leia, frowning. But you said Neil doesn't know about the book. He expects to receive documents from you. Documents aren't exactly inconspicuous. Leia shrugged a bit impatiently. Whatever Neil may have expected to find, I don't know. He didn't say in the message, but he may have thought his contact had the time to take precaution. The matter was urgent, and he would have left what he could, believing Neil would find it before either the Turkish or German authorities stumbled onto it being important. The book left in plain sight. Yes, I suppose you're right. But Neil must have seen the paper on the bureau and recognized the coded word left for him by Major Rooter. Why didn't he respond to it the way you did? Didn't you say that only someone who wasn't on our side would have passed it by as meaningless, the same as Wooley's book? Neil would have gone out of his way to look for it. Yes, and he must have done just that and missed it. On the desk? Hardly. You didn't miss it. Why would Neil, if he was the third man? It was on the floor when I found it. Allison leaned toward her in the chair. But how did it get there? Only the murderer would have brushed it aside while in a hurry, searching. Leia frowned. Remember, the front door was standing open when I arrived. The wind had risen. The curtains were moving. I distinctly recall that much. It would have been easy for it to blow off the desk onto the floor before Neil saw it. I saw it because I lit a match. I don't know what Neil may have done before I entered the hut, or why he didn't find it. It could have been any number of things. He might not have had time to look on the desk, but went straight to Carl's luggage. The way Colonel Holman's did, yes. But if it were Neil, Allison pressed, and he did see the coded word Hittite EBG, why didn't he realize the real information was in Wooley's book on the Hittites? Why didn't it ring a bell? Why didn't he guess? Why should he? It took us a day to figure out its meaning, and if he had only been able to begin his search before he was interrupted by our arrival, well, you see, he may not have even gone there yet. You're right, I suppose. Not suppose. That's the way it is. Utter relief filled Leia's face. Allison, I'm betting everything it's going to be all right. Neil will meet with his contact tomorrow. Between them, they'll decipher the message in the book. By tomorrow night, we'll both be out of here on our way to Cairo. And if you let me, I'd like to go home with you for a few months. Let you? I'd be delighted, and so would Mother and Father. Leia's optimism and the change in conversation with thoughts of home were enough to offer Allison reason to hope. Even so, a spot in the back of her mind continued to leave its dark blotch of unease. Then is Neil coming here? To the hut? No, I'm to meet him. It's safer that way. Someone might be watching for his arrival, but they don't expect to see me since they think I'm gone. They'll be off guard, and I'll wear a scarf to cover my hair when I leave. We won't take chances. Leia knew more than she was able to tell Allison. It was understandable, but the unknown left Allison struggling against her own frustrations. How can you meet him? Is he in Aleppo? Leia hesitated, as if debating how much she could tell Allison. No, there's a small hut out near the digs. We used it as a midway place to store pieces when we couldn't make it all the way into Jerusalem.
I guess.
We'll leave a candle burning in the window if it's safe to enter. He'll leave a candle. How did you expect to get there unseen? They may be watching the Mercedes. I won't be using that, but a Vigo we hit 1/4 of a mile from here. Neil took care of that before we ever arrived for the club meeting. Even a mouse has several escape routes, and we, too, leave a second door open for escape, or a third, if we can. Can't Neil meet us in Cairo? Allison pressed as her concerns grew. She shook her head firmly. His contact is here. You mean he doesn't know who his superior is? Not until he meets him. Neither Neil nor I is considered high up. Our job is to collect information on the railway. Rumors about what Germany may be up to. It doesn't sound like much, but when it's put together with the information Carl discovered, well, sometimes we strike gold. Or murder, thought Allison. And you, Neil, and the British agent found gold at the Baghdad Railway. And that's about it. She stood looking about at Allison's books and papers. Now, all I need to do is gather red herring information to take with me, just to play safe. Would you mind terribly if I borrowed your books? Go ahead. Take my Bible, too, if you would like. Leia, Let me go with you to meet Neil. I feel much better about this. We both have revolvers. Leia shook her head, her blonde hair swaying. I've put you in enough danger, and I'd answer to Neil's superior if I involved you too much. If he found out I was confiding in you, I'd be reprimanded, even removed. Remember, as far as they're concerned, there's no reason you should be trusted. For all we know, you may be the enemy. Although uncalled for, Allison felt insulted. Me? Why, I'm a loyal British as His Majesty. Leia smiled. You've proved it to me, but they wouldn't see it that way without thoroughly searching your past, as young as you are. So you see, this is something I must do alone. It was my choice to involve myself. No one twisted my arm, and I accept this job because I believed in what I was doing. She smiled. So don't worry, you still have several days left of the holiday. You might as well stay and try to enjoy it. Now you should be able to. Neil wants it that way too. He was furious you're involved. It was like Neil to act like a big brother toward her as well as toward Leia, his blood sister. Allison loved him for it. Besides, only I can meet Neil. What if something happens and you can't make it back by tomorrow? A faint shadow crossed Leia's face. If I'm not back by then, if something delays me, I'll be in touch some other way. Or Neil will contact you. We'll get you back to Cairo safely somehow. It's not my getting back that worries me. I can take care of myself, but you're going off alone. If anything looks suspicious, a signal to turn back has been arranged. Don't worry. I know what to do. It's my job. She smiled at Allison's frown. Look. She opened the flap of her dress, showing a small leather holster with a revolver. I've got this. I'm never without it, and I assure you I can use it without hesitation when I must. Allison remembered her own revolver and who had given it to her. Have you ever heard of Brett Holden? She asked curiously. No. Why? She sighed. No reason, I guess. I was rather hoping, but she stopped. He was a friend of David's. I guess from what David said that this Holden could be in espionage work. David was to meet him here, but Brett hasn't shown up either. David seemed to think you and Neil knew him. Leia considered. Brett Holden. Almost sounds like Brent Holman, said Allison easily, watching Leia. She wondered if she thought so only because she had found the German officer attractive and hoped he might actually be on their side. You don't suppose Colonel Holman was really your contact or Neil's? Allison speculated. And he didn't know you were hiding in my hut, so he went to Carchemish looking for you and Neil? Leia stood staring at her. After what seemed to Allison a long silence, Leia let out a sigh. I wonder, good heavens, what if, like Major Reuter, Colonel Holman was one of us? We've crossed purposes. But at least I'll see Neil tonight. The information is safe, and we'll both get a surprise if, when we meet his superior, it turns out to be the Colonel. It couldn't be, said Allison firmly, rebuking herself for the flicker of hope that arose from the darkness. He was utterly ruthless. Once he knew I was British and your cousin, what need was there to badger me? No one else was with us, so who did he need to impress with his harsh questioning? Yes, you're probably right, but I'll keep that name in mind just the same, and mention it to Neil tonight. An hour or two after midnight, the desert winds began to sigh and whistle along the roofs of the darkened huts and stir through the date palms growing in front of the compound. Leia was dressed for survival in the desert heat, and she carried her kit bag, which she had carefully packed with Allison's books, Bible, and a sheaf of misleading papers. Allison unbolted the back door and stepped out onto the porch, checking to make certain the way was clear. She wished the moon had set, but at least its light on the porch had narrowed as the moon moved up in the sky. The grounds with a fringe of palms appeared deserted. The only movement came from Allison as she looked about her for a moment, listening to the silence. Then turning, she motioned to Leia that it was safe. You've left me no choice, whispered Allison. I still feel strongly about the need to come with you. Leia smiled and unexpectedly reached over and gave Allison an embrace. Don't worry, Zoe. Look for me soon. We'll become the cousins we should have been. For once in my life, I feel like going to a grand dinner ball in Cairo. You can loan me one of your fancy dresses and introduce me to one of your many admirers. I've grown extraordinarily weary of boots and canvas. Then she was gone, slipping away in the shadows with the wind. Allison stood by the side of her hut, looking after Leia. Feeling alone and empty, she swallowed. Nothing stirred but the wind and sand. "The Lord bless you and watch and guard and keep you," she prayed silently. A minute later, Allison turned away with a shiver, though the wind was hot and dry as she made her way back around to the side of her hut. She felt unable to cast off the smothering depression that hounded her spirits, despite committing Leah to God. The white moonlight slanted over Major Reuter's abandoned hut and turned the roof into silver. Below, the wooden walls stood draped in dark shadow. She could hear the distant muffled mutter of dry lightning on the desert hills. She had not progressed far on the narrow incline between her hut and Major Reuter's when she heard another sound, the creak of a back door closing.
Oh.
Allison checked, not daring to breathe. She turned and stared toward the abandoned hut. Had someone been in there and just gone out to follow Leah? Someone must have been nearby all this time while she talked with Leah in the darkness and was now closing the door with extreme care. She heard the click of a door latch falling into place. It was a long time before she dared to move, but she stood in the hot night, recalling with a prickle of her neck her cousin's confident words earlier this evening. "I've heard from Neil. Everything is going to be all right." Was Leah's confidence misplaced after all? Perhaps the murderer of the British agent had been waiting here all the time, as near as Major Reuter's hut, just waiting for Leah to leave. Allison stood rigid with fear. She waited for footsteps on the porch, but if there were any, the wind covered the sound. She was still standing there minutes later when the thin path of moonlight moved behind her hut. Her fingers on her gun in her pocket, she moved forward. When she reached the steps to her back porch and looked across the Major's porch, it was empty. As she imagined that creak, it was possible. The wind did strange things.